near Enfidaville, May 13, 1943. The desert sun rose over the jagged Tunisian horizon, painting the sand and rock in shades of orange and grey that concealed the echoes of collapse. For weeks, Axis forces had crumbled under the combined pressure of the US 2 Corps, British 8th Army, and relentless airstrikes from Allied tactical bombers. The once formidable Italian 131st Armoured Division Centauro now trudged towards surrender, their armoured columns reduced to rusting hulks, immobilized by months of attrition and the unforgiving North African terrain. The surrender was unlike any the men had experienced. Thousands of Italian soldiers poured across the open plains, hands raised, eyes wary but resigned. British and American guards kept their distance at first, unsure how to manage the sheer scale of the capitulation. The event would later be recorded as the largest Italian surrender of the war up to that date, preceding even the chaos of the armistice months later in September. Reports filed by the USS Corps describe it as an orderly, almost surreal procession of men and machines, a mixture of pride, fatigue, and relief etched on sunburned faces. Among these prisoners were specialists whose skills would soon distinguish them: mechanics, engineers, drivers, and tank crewmen of the 131st Centauro. For them, surrender did not mean the cessation of duty. It meant a quiet vigilance, an attempt to preserve the integrity of what remained under their hands. Their leader, Sergente Meccanico Vittorio Lupo, stood apart from the crowd. 40 years old, wiry, with hands scarred from years of engine repair and desert improvisation, Lupo had survived the Italian campaigns in Libya and Tunisia, witnessing the ebb and flow of fortune and the rapid collapse of his nation's armoured formations. His eyes, dark and unyielding, surveyed the emerging POW compound with the careful precision of a man cataloguing resources and liabilities alike. U.S. Army. Processing reports from Ksar Saïd would later note the separation of Italian and German captives. The Germans, still regarded as the senior partners in the Axis coalition, were segregated into adjacent compounds, while Italian soldiers, especially specialists, were organized with careful oversight to prevent sabotage, escape, or political agitation. High-value technical prisoners, the report read, are to be catalogued, interrogated lightly, and assigned non-critical labor until further assessment. It was routine on paper, but in practice, the prisoners quickly learned that their skills gave them leverage, subtle but undeniable, in the hierarchy of captivity. Lupo's 10 men were a mixture of hardened veterans and younger technicians recently assigned to armored units. Mario Fontana, a wiry driver with a reputation for improvising field repairs with little more than wire and a hammer. Alessandro Ricci, whose expertise in suspension and torsion bars rivaled the instruction manuals. Enrico Salvatori, the youngest of the group at 19, assigned as a loader, but possessed of an uncanny aptitude for engine diagnostics. And Giuseppe Marini, a taciturn radio operator with mechanical skill learned from family workshops in Naples. Together, they formed a nucleus within the larger pool of Italian POWs, observers, organizers, and silent engineers, invisible to most of the Allied guards but quietly respected within the barracks. The POW camp itself was utilitarian. Barbed wire fences crisscrossed the sand, watchtowers rose like skeletal sentinels, and wooden barracks offered minimal shelter from the heat. By day, the men were assigned routine labor moving supplies, repairing Allied vehicles, digging drainage ditches, or performing light maintenance on trucks and jeeps. Allied intelligence reports noted that the Italians approached these tasks with professional diligence. Engines that might have sputtered into silence under inexperienced hands hummed steadily under their attention. Yet, beneath the surface, a silent plan began to crystallize. The sound of engines became a constant, haunting backdrop. At dusk, when the day's labor ended, the camp would settle into uneasy silence. Guards patrolled methodically, their shadows stretching long across the sand. Within the barracks, Lupo and his men began to speak in low tones about what they had seen, repaired, and understood. "A tank is like a living thing," Lupo whispered one night, tracing the arc of a torsion bar with his finger. You listen to it. You feel it. You don't just drive it. You know it. The others nodded. Mechanics like them, trained to diagnose and repair under the harshest conditions, found the stillness of captivity almost intolerable. It was in this quiet, after roll call and evening rations, that they began to notice opportunities. Allied vehicles, Sherman M4s, Stuart light tanks, and half-tracks moved into the camp for repair. Often, the Americans would leave engines idling overnight, parts scattered across the maintenance yard, or tanks parked with hatches open and fuel tanks half full. Lupo observed the routines carefully, noting guards' patrol cycles, light schedules, and the movement of fuel trucks. What the camp had, he realized, was a set of vulnerabilities invisible to the casual eye, a chance to exercise skill, maintain pride in their craft, and perhaps leave a mark without attracting notice. The first night they acted was quiet, almost ritualistic. Using the skills honed in the deserts of Libya and Tunisia, the group moved under moonlight to a small group of disabled Shermans. With nothing more than hand tools, ingenuity, and careful coordination, they restored engines to working order, repaired jammed turrets, and replaced worn track links. No guard saw them, no American sergeant questioned them. By dawn, the tanks were operational, ready for assignment, and silently credited to the POW work detail. This quiet competence became a pattern. Night after night, under the surveillance of tired or inattentive guards, the Italian mechanics performed covert repairs. Engines that might have failed in combat hummed with renewed life. Tracks that could have snapped under the weight of armored crews were tensioned and lubricated. Radios and optics were adjusted, cleaned, and calibrated. Each repair was precise, purposeful, and invisible, leaving no evidence of their presence except for the restored machines themselves. In the barracks, camaraderie grew among the men, tied together not by ideology, but by skill and survival. They shared stories of campaigns long ended, jokes about impossible missions, and whispered plans for future repairs. Lupo emphasized discipline. "We are prisoners," he reminded them nightly, "but our work speaks louder than any shout." The men came to understand that their value lay not in defiance, but in competence, the ability to manipulate machinery in silence, to keep the vehicles ready without seeking recognition. By the end of May 1943, Ksar Saïd held dozens of Italian POWs, and their reputation as silent artisans had begun to circulate. Allied officers noticed that tanks and vehicles seemed more reliable than expected, yet no one could explain why. The Italians themselves never spoke, never took credit, and never asked for reward. The work became a ritual of pride and skill, a quiet defiance that carried the weight of honor and the echoes of lost campaigns. The chapter closes on a haunting image. The last patrol of the day passes the perimeter, leaving the camp quiet and still. Inside the maintenance yard, a row of Shermans idles softly, their engines purring like a symphony of secrecy. Through the thin barbed wire fence, the desert stretches endlessly. Yet within this small compound, 10 Italian men have carved out a space of autonomy, discipline, and ingenuity. They are prisoners, yet they are guardians of steel, the unsung custodians of Allied armor, working in silence, unseen, and unstoppable. Ksar Saïd, Tunisia, May 20th, 1943. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the desert encased in a brittle, cool darkness. Within the POW compound, the camp settled into its nightly rhythm. Guards performed their rounds with mechanical diligence, the metallic click of rifles against straps, and the occasional whistle echoing across sand and barbed wire. Most of the prisoners had retired, exhausted from a day of forced labor and the suffocating heat. But in the maintenance yard, a small cluster of Italian men remained alert, poised to begin their true work. Sergente Meccanico Vittorio Lupo moved silently among them, eyes scanning the perimeter before giving the nod. Mario Fontana, crouched by the rear track of a Sherman M4, held a wrench and a rolled-up rag. Alessandro Ricci checked the torsion bars on another vehicle, ensuring proper tension and alignment. Enrico Salvatore, barely visible in the shadows, had his hands deep in the engine compartment of a disabled Stuart light tank. Each man performed his task with precision, honed through years in armored divisions, desert campaigns, and the crucible of battlefield improvisation. The night had a particular rhythm, one dictated not by orders, but by experience. Lupo had studied the guard rotations, the patterns of searchlights, and the routines of fuel deliveries. It was a choreography learned over the previous week, tested and refined under observation of nothing more formidable than moonlight and the faint hum of idling engines. Timing was everything. A single misstep could mean exposure, arrest, or worse. And yet, the men moved as though the danger itself were a companion, guiding their hands rather than hindering them. The first vehicles of the night were tanks recently returned from patrol and minor skirmishes in the surrounding desert. Their engines had been compromised by heat, sand, and overuse. Tracks were worn, clutches were stiff. American mechanics had attempted repairs but lacked the finesse and knowledge to coax these machines back to full operational status. Lupo's team, trained on Italian designs but adaptable by necessity, saw what others overlooked. The Sherman was not perfect, but it was robust. With patience and expertise, they restored engines, replaced worn suspension components, and adjusted the gearing. By the time dawn approached, the tanks hummed smoothly, as if the desert had never harmed them. It was more than repair, it was transformation. The Italians refined the vehicles beyond what the Americans had achieved during the day. Tracks were lubricated to minimize friction. Engines were tuned to respond with a sharper throttle. Hatches and turrets were adjusted for smoother rotation. Fontana, inspecting a Sherman's gearbox, remarked in a whisper, "A little patience, and even the largest engine will obey you." Each adjustment, each fine turn of a wrench, was a quiet assertion of control over machines that had once carried him into battle under a flag now surrendered. Night after night, the pattern repeated. Guards grew accustomed to the faint glow of oil lamps left by the day shift, the rustle of tarp covers over idle tanks. None suspected the Italians working in the shadows. In the barracks, whispers of their nightly endeavors remained tightly controlled. No tales of heroism, no bragging, only the shared understanding that their skills mattered, that these tanks were more than metal, they were lifelines for the men who would soon face the desert and the remnants of Axis resistance. The group began to develop a systematic approach. Each evening, vehicles were inspected and triaged. Tanks with the most critical failures were prioritized, followed by light vehicles. Salvatore kept meticulous notes on engine hours, component wear, and fuel system integrity. Ricci created improvised gauges to measure torsion bar stress and track tension. Marini, working in near silence, kept radios and communication equipment calibrated, ensuring that vehicles were fully functional even for long patrols. Lupo oversaw the workflow, making decisions with the precision of a field commander rather than a prisoner. As the nights passed, the Italians began to innovate. Using scavenged parts and the fragments of wrecked vehicles, they created small but critical improvements. Suspension components were reinforced to endure rough desert terrain. Engine air filters were modified to reduce the intake of sand. Lubricants were carefully mixed to perform under extreme temperature fluctuations. Each adaptation was a lesson in resourcefulness, born from years of experience and the acute awareness that they could not rely on outside support. They worked not merely to repair, but to optimize. Occasionally, Allied supply trucks brought new tanks and vehicles to the compound. Lupo's team received these silently, assessing them for immediate repairs and modifications. Some vehicles had minor damage from transportation or rough terrain. Others were untested and unfamiliar. Within the span of a single night, Italian hands could render a damaged Sherman as capable as, or in some ways superior to, a fresh machine. By the second week, a quiet pattern had emerged. Vehicles left the compound fully operational, sometimes faster and more reliable than American crews expected. The psychological element of their work became apparent as well. The Americans noticed improved vehicle readiness but attributed it to training and diligence rather than the subtle craftsmanship of the Italians. Engineers, mechanics, and officers, noted the reliability, the consistency of engines, and the unexpected resilience of vehicles in field tests. Unknown to them, the Italian POWs were behind these results. Night after night, their silent labor kept the Allied armor fleet functional, ready, and unexpectedly efficient. The work also served as a subtle act of preservation. Each repair was a moral assertion, a reclamation of pride in skill and expertise. Our country may be defeated, but our hands have not failed, he said one night, adjusting a turret gear. The machines we touch will move, they will perform, that is our strength. The men internalized this lesson, working with a mix of discipline and quiet defiance. Each night was a ritual of control and competence, a reaffirmation of identity in the midst of captivity. As the chapter drew to a close, the camp was enveloped in the desert's pre-dawn stillness. Lupo and his men returned quietly to the barracks, leaving behind a yard of engines softly idling, tracks aligned, and vehicles ready for the day shift. The moonlight glinted off polished metal, a subtle testimony to their labor. Guards would arrive moments later to find operational tanks awaiting inspection, unaware of the invisible mechanics who had ensured their readiness. In the stillness, the Italian POWs understood their unique position, prisoners in form, masters of steel in function. By the end of May 1943, the night shift had become a fixture of Ksar Saïd. Vehicles that would otherwise have failed in the field were transformed by unseen hands. The Italians had created a silent alliance with the machines themselves, a pact of expertise, precision, and dedication. Their work went unnoticed by the wider war effort, yet its impact would ripple outward in subtle, decisive ways, preserving the operational capability of Allied armored units and leaving a record of ingenuity and discipline that would be noted by history only decades later. Ksar Saïd, Tunisia, June 3, 1943. The morning sun rose over the wire fences and sandy compounds, casting long shadows over tanks and half-tracks lined like silent sentinels. American and British officers conducted their routine inspections, clipboard in hand, unaware that the vehicles they evaluated were more than the sum of their factory specifications. Engines purred smoothly, turrets rotated with ease, and tracks held tension far beyond the typical wear expected in the North African desert. Each vehicle bore the invisible signature of 10 Italian POWs working under the cover of night. Sergente Meccanico Vittorio Lupo and his men had begun to notice the subtle, cumulative effect of their efforts. Patrol units reported higher operational availability. Vehicles returned from the desert undamaged, where American mechanics predicted breakdowns. The 9th Armored Division had been struggling with overheating transmissions, uneven track wear, and engines seizing under high-temperature conditions. By late May, however, reports began to indicate an almost anomalous reliability. Tanks and armored cars that should have been sidelined were instead completing missions without incident. It was Lieutenant Colonel James Whitman of Centauro who first began asking questions. His initial inquiries were straightforward. What factors had improved vehicle reliability? American crews insisted it was routine maintenance, a combination of field discipline and supply improvements. But Whitman, noting the sheer consistency of outcomes across multiple units, raised an eyebrow. These vehicles, he told a senior NCO, are performing better than expected, almost as if someone knows exactly what they need before they fail. Unknown to him, that someone was Lupo's night crew. Over the past 3 weeks, the Italian POWs had systematically refined nearly every critical system on every vehicle that passed through the compound. Clutch plates were resurfaced to exact tolerances, minimizing slippage in extreme heat. Track tension was balanced to prevent uneven wear that could cripple a unit during long desert marches. Engine carburetors were adjusted to compensate for variations in fuel quality, ensuring optimal combustion. Even radios received delicate calibrations to maintain communication without signal loss. Every repair was informed by years of battlefield experience, a keen understanding of mechanical theory, and an intimate knowledge of Italian armored doctrine adapted to Allied vehicles. The first major operational test came on June 7th, when elements of the 9th Armored advanced toward Enfidaville to secure key supply routes. Temperatures soared past 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and the terrain alternated between sand dunes and rocky outcroppings that had previously shredded tracks and overheated engines. Yet the vehicles performed flawlessly. American crews, many still unfamiliar with desert conditions, marveled at how Shermans and Stuarts seemed to anticipate the challenges of the terrain. Engines did not stall, transmissions did not lock, and radios functioned across long distances without interruption. The officers were astounded, attributing the success to standard maintenance protocols, never realizing the hand of Italian POWs at work. Lupo, observing from a distance near a guard tower under the cover of darkness, understood the larger implications. Each fully functional tank meant fewer breakdowns in the field, fewer soldiers stranded under enemy fire, and a subtle but critical increase in Allied operational tempo. His team had become silent contributors to the broader war effort, transforming the very tools of combat without recognition. By keeping vehicles at peak performance, they were effectively multiplying the combat effectiveness of entire armored columns. The night work also had tactical consequences that extended beyond mechanical reliability. Units assigned to reconnaissance and fast-moving assaults found they could push deeper into enemy lines without pausing for repairs. Armored columns reported fewer bottlenecks caused by mechanical failures, and logistical chains ran more smoothly. The combination of speed, endurance, and reliability allowed Allied commanders to plan operations that would have been too risky in early May. Tanks repaired, optimized by the Italian POWs, could now operate continuously for days, maintaining pressure on retreating Axis forces and securing strategic positions across central Tunisia. Field reports began to reflect an almost superhuman performance by armored units. The 339th Fighter Squadron, attached to the mechanized columns for air-ground coordination, noted a marked improvement in ground support reliability. Tanks arrived on schedule for infantry advances. Damaged vehicles were repaired quickly, allowing units to maintain momentum against Axis rearguards. The POW's unseen labor had effectively increased the operational reach of Allied forces, a form of influence that officers in command staff offices would later describe as critical, though intangible. Even German intelligence, monitoring the region through aerial reconnaissance and intercepted communications, began to register anomalies. They observed that Allied armor moved faster, sustained longer operational periods, and engaged enemy forces with unusual efficiency. Reports described vehicles maintaining positions that, under normal circumstances, should have required rotation or repair. Field officers noted the disparity and assumed either superior American engineering or extraordinary luck, but never considered that enemy POWs were enhancing the very machines they fought against. The psychological impact on the POWs themselves was profound. Unlike prisoners who waited for liberation or endured the monotony of confinement, Lupo's team had a purpose, a mission within the confines of captivity. The act of restoring and optimizing machines allowed them to reclaim agency in a world defined by surrender and limitation. Each repaired tank was a silent victory, proof that skill, discipline, and ingenuity could operate even under duress. Morale within the night crew remained high, bound by shared expertise, secrecy, and the quiet thrill of mastery over powerful engines. As June progressed, the POWs began to leave, subtle signatures of their work, small adjustments that would go unnoticed during cursory inspections but significantly improved field performance. Track pins were reinforced with slight modifications to prevent breakage under heavy load. Turret gears were greased with improvised lubricants that resisted sand infiltration. Engine belts and pulleys were tensioned for optimal efficiency, increasing both speed and fuel economy. These were not revolutionary innovations, but they multiplied the effectiveness of Allied armored forces at a scale far beyond what American crews could accomplish under standard procedures. By the end of June 1943, Lupo's night crew had established an informal, unseen network of mechanical excellence. They operated with precision, timing, and an acute awareness of the broader operational context. Vehicles repaired under their hands were not simply functional, they were optimized instruments of war, ready to deliver decisive impact on the battlefield. Allied officers would marvel at their efficiency, soldiers would rely on their durability, and German forces would face increasingly formidable resistance, unaware of the invisible engineers responsible for the machines they feared. In quiet moments before dawn, Lupo would often walk among the parked tanks, running a hand along the polished steel and oiled tracks. The engines were silent now, but the latent power hummed beneath the surface, a testimony to discipline and skill. He understood that the true influence of his work could never be claimed or recognized publicly. Yet the results were unmistakable. The night shift had awakened not only to repair tanks, but to shape the course of operations, to amplify the reach and effectiveness of forces that would eventually sweep across Tunisia and beyond. When the sun rose on June 30th, 1943, the Allied advance had gained momentum. Axis resistance in Tunisia crumbled, and armoured columns reached objectives days ahead of schedule. Tanks moved, without delay, artillery positions were supported effectively, and infantry benefited from a seamless armoured presence. The subtle, cumulative work of a group of Italian POWs operating under the cover of night, unseen and uncredited, had ensured that Allied armoured forces performed at levels previously thought unattainable. Their influence, though hidden, was decisive. Ksar Saïd, Tunisia, July 5, 1943. Night had descended with an almost ceremonial quiet. The compound, a grid of wire fences and sandbagged bunkers, was cloaked in darkness, punctuated only by the faint glow of oil lamps in distant guard towers. Inside the POW barracks, 10 Italian mechanics moved with disciplined precision, their work unhurried but purposeful. Each had memorized not only the layout of the compound but also the idiosyncrasies of every tank that passed through their hands. They were artisans of war, operating a hidden arsenal of skills rather than weaponry. Sergente Meccanico Vittorio Lupo, the unofficial leader of the group, gathered the men near a decommissioned Sherman, its hull propped open and tracks partially removed. "Tonight," he said, voice low but firm, "we do more than repair. We prepare. Every tank that leaves here must carry our signature, reliability, endurance, and silent lethality." The men nodded, understanding both the weight and the subtle danger of their undertaking. A single misstep, an exposed adjustment, a misaligned part could alert the guards, risking arrest or worse. The POW's work extended beyond routine maintenance. They had begun improvising solutions for problems that American mechanics had either overlooked or deemed unsolvable. Radiator hoses, prone to rupturing in desert heat, were reinforced with braided wire linings, hidden beneath standard covers. Transmission gears were carefully shimmed to prevent catastrophic failure during long climbs over rugged terrain. Suspension components, often the first to fail under heavy armor and constant maneuvering, were lubricated with proprietary mixtures derived from available materials, granting weeks of additional service life without drawing attention. One of the more ingenious adaptations involved fuel systems. The POWs observed that American diesel and gasoline supplies were often inconsistent, contaminated, or diluted to stretch logistical chains. Lupo and his men devised filtration assemblies hidden within the fuel lines, capable of removing particulates that would normally clog injectors and carburetors. It was a simple adjustment on the surface, but in practice it allowed engines to maintain peak power output without hesitation, even under desert conditions that would typically cripple American armored columns. Weapon systems received the same careful attention. The Sherman's main gun had been notorious for jamming under rapid-fire conditions, particularly when crews fired in extended sequences. Lupo's men introduced subtle modifications to recoil mechanisms and lubrication routines, reducing the frequency of stoppages while maintaining the integrity of the weapon. Secondary armaments, machine guns mounted on turrets, were cleaned, tuned, and aligned with precision, ensuring that when crews returned fire, bullets struck true with minimal dispersion. To American soldiers, these tanks seemed almost flawless. To the Italians, the work was painstaking but necessary, a silent assertion of competence in a world that had stripped them of agency. The POWs also expanded their operations beyond single tanks. Using spare parts scavenged from broken vehicles, abandoned workshops, and supply dumps within the compound, they created a small reserve of emergency components. Axle shafts, track links, and turret bearings were catalogued meticulously in a crude ledger, each item labeled with the vehicle it could repair. This clandestine stockpile became a secret arsenal, a hidden repository that allowed the Italians to restore damaged tanks far faster than official supply chains could respond. Operational security was paramount. Work was performed after guards had completed their rounds, under the cover of night. The men moved silently, communicating through hand signals and whispered Italian. Tools were checked out and returned to improvised storage, leaving no trace of tampering. Even the smallest noises, a dropped wrench, a loose bolt, were avoided at all costs. Lupo instilled a philosophy of precision and caution, recognizing that the consequences of discovery could be severe. Yet the men worked with calm determination, bound by shared expertise and the knowledge that their labor directly contributed to Allied victories. The compound itself became a canvas for ingenuity. Barracks walls concealed hidden panels where sensitive adjustments and spare parts were stored. Sandbags around fuel depots were subtly repositioned to allow quick access during emergencies. Even the guard towers were considered in their planning. The POWs learned patrol schedules, noting blind spots and timing intervals with the meticulousness of engineers plotting a blueprint. Every action was calculated, every movement deliberate. The arsenal they maintained was as much about knowledge and foresight as it was about metal and machinery. The first test of their full capabilities came unexpectedly on July 10th. A vehicle convoy preparing to advance toward Tunis reported multiple mechanical failures that threatened to delay the operation. Engines overheated, transmissions groaned under load, and tracks slipped on the uneven terrain. In ordinary circumstances, replacement vehicles would have been dispatched from the rear, costing hours, if not days. Lupo's men, however, had anticipated such scenarios. They mobilized a small team under the cover of darkness, accessing their hidden reserves and performing precision repairs on the stalled tanks. By dawn, every vehicle was operational, ready to rejoin the convoy without alerting American officers or enemy intelligence. The impact of this night work was not lost on field operations. The convoy moved faster than expected, arriving at strategic positions before Axis forces could react. Reports from reconnaissance units indicated that enemy garrisons, prepared to mount delaying actions, were bypassed entirely. Tanks that should have been sidelined under normal wear were suddenly present in numbers sufficient to alter the tactical balance. The POW's secret arsenal, invisible and uncredited, had directly influenced the outcome of a frontline maneuver. Psychologically, the work had a profound effect on the Italians themselves. Unlike POWs resigned to idleness, they operated with purpose, maintaining discipline and morale through competence. Each night spent in the dim glow of oil lamps, hands coated with grease and engines humming under their touch, reaffirmed a sense of agency. They were not merely prisoners, they were architects of mechanical resilience, shaping the battlefield from within the confines of captivity. By the end of July 1943, the effectiveness of Ksar Saïd's armored units had improved noticeably. Command reports praised the mechanical readiness and operational reliability of tanks and half-tracks, attributing performance gains to standard maintenance routines. What was never documented, however, was the invisible work of 10 Italian POWs who had effectively constructed a clandestine arsenal of mechanical precision. Every vehicle that rolled out of the compound carried the imprint of their skill, a silent testament to ingenuity under duress. Even German reconnaissance could not account for the anomaly. Axis observers noted tanks operating with unexpected efficiency, advancing rapidly across difficult terrain without breakdowns. Field reports assumed luck, supply quality, or American mechanics' diligence, but never that the very men they had once considered enemies were quietly enhancing the machines. The Italians' influence remained hidden, their contributions recorded nowhere but in the subtle improvement of Allied operational capability. As August approached, the POWs' work would expand further, anticipating the eventual push into Sicily and beyond. Their secret arsenal carefully curated parts, precision repairs, and ingenious modifications would multiply Allied effectiveness, demonstrating how skill, secrecy, and determination could shape the course of operations without ever firing a single shot. By night's end, the men of Ksar Saïd retreated to their bunks, exhausted but fulfilled. Engines rested, tracks gleamed under the lanterns, and the compound returned to its daytime stillness. Outside the wire, the war continued, oblivious to the small, clandestine force shaping the future of armored warfare. Inside, 10 Italians had become the unseen architects of efficiency, the silent custodians of an arsenal that would alter the battlefield in ways no report, no medal, and no citation would ever acknowledge. Ksar Saïd, Tunisia, August 12, 1943. The desert sun had barely dipped below the horizon, yet the heat lingered, heavy and unrelenting. Inside the POW compound, silence had a weight, a quiet tension that only grew under the watchful eyes of guards. The 10 Italian mechanics had been at work for months, every night pushing the limits of ingenuity and secrecy. Now, the strain began to show. Sergente Meccanico Vittorio Lupo observed his team as they moved through the shadows, repairing half-tracks and armored Shermans. The men were efficient, methodical, but fatigue etched their faces. Fingers stained with grease trembled slightly. Shoulders sagged under the weight of responsibility. Each night brought the same calculation. Repair enough to make a difference on the battlefield while avoiding discovery by the Americans overseeing their labor. The margin for error was razor-thin. One misaligned track, one clanging tool, one careless word could unravel months of carefully guarded operations. The compound had grown more active as the Allied advance towards Sicily accelerated. Convoys of tanks and trucks arrived daily, some damaged from desert operations, others suffering mechanical failures from heavy use. Lupo's men worked tirelessly, their own exhaustion masked behind stoic expressions. Yet the Americans began to notice anomalies, repairs completed faster than expected, tanks returning to operational status with near-perfect reliability. Questions arose. Captain Henry Caldwell, a U.S. Army ordnance officer, had begun observing the Italians closely. "They're good," he remarked to a colleague one afternoon. "Too good." Caldwell's suspicions were mild, the kind born of professional curiosity rather than distrust, but in the context of wartime paranoia, even the smallest anomaly was noteworthy. The POWs, sensing scrutiny, tightened their routines. Every tool was returned to its proper place, every bolt talked to. Specification. Every night operation performed with almost ritualistic caution. Tension mounted further when a guard, Private First Class Samuel O'Donnell, inadvertently wandered into a restricted section of the workshop one evening. Lupo froze, his mind racing. The man had strayed during a routine patrol, oblivious to the delicate choreography unfolding among the shadows. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then, with a mixture of quiet authority and practiced calm, Lupo stepped forward. "Signor O'Donnell," he whispered in heavily accented English, "please return to your post. All is secure." O'Donnell, disoriented and swatting at the flies of the desert night, nodded and left without further incident. But the episode left a mark, the realization that discovery could come at any moment, without warning. Meanwhile, operational demands escalated. The Allied push into Sicily had intensified, and the number of armored vehicles passing through Ksar Saïd multiplied. Some arrived after combat engagements, riddled with shrapnel, punctured radiators, and bent suspensions. Lupo's team faced a dilemma. prioritize urgent repairs for tanks critical to immediate operations, or allocate time for meticulous improvements designed to increase reliability over the long term. Each decision was a gamble with the lives of soldiers who would never know the Italians' hand had preserved their machines. The psychological toll was compounded by the constant presence of Axis prisoners from nearby German units. Though segregated by national contingents, intelligence reports indicated that German guards occasionally overheard or observed unusual activity. The Italians worked under a perpetual shadow, aware that any slip could be misconstrued as sabotage or collusion. For the mechanics, the desert nights were a delicate balance between precision and fear, engineering and survival. On August 19th, the breaking point arrived. A convoy of Sherman tanks, recently engaged skirmishes near Gela, pulled into the compound with severe mechanical failures. Engines had overheated, gearboxes were stripped, and tracks had been torn off by rocky terrain. Lupo convened his team in a dimly lit corner of the workshop. "This is the night," he said, voice low but firm. "We either make a difference or risk everything." The men nodded, adrenaline overriding exhaustion. Every eye reflected the gravity of the moment. One miscalculation could expose their secret operations to both Allied officers and enemy reconnaissance. They worked through the night, moving with the precision of surgeons. Engine blocks were dismantled and rebuilt, radiators reinforced, transmissions carefully shimmed and aligned. Fuel filters were inspected and upgraded, lubrication systems meticulously adjusted. Every adjustment was documented mentally, stored in Lupo's memory as much as in the crude ledger they kept. The work was both mechanical and psychological, a test of endurance, discipline, and ingenuity under extreme pressure. At 3 a.m., a sudden problem arose. One tank's turret had been damaged in combat, its traverse mechanism jammed. Attempting to free it risked stripping gears or alerting guards to the prolonged noise. Lupo assessed the situation quickly, devising an improvised solution. Using a combination of jury-rigged levers and carefully timed hydraulic adjustments, the turret was freed without drawing attention. A collective, silent sigh of relief passed through the men. For now, the night's labor would go unnoticed. As dawn approached, the 10 Italians stood back, surveying their work. The convoy of tanks was fully operational, gleaming under the first light of morning. Engines roared to life with a reliability that defied the desert heat and combat damage. Lupo felt a quiet satisfaction, but also an undercurrent of dread. The night's efforts had pushed them to the limits of human and mechanical endurance. Repetition of such feats would inevitably increase the risk of exposure. The consequences of discovery were stark. Allied intelligence protocols dictated that any suspected unauthorized repairs or tampering by POWs would be met with immediate investigation, potentially leading to severe punishment or transfer. Lupo had long considered these risks, weighing them against the greater impact of their work on the battlefield. Each night, the choice was clear in his mind: improve the tanks, save lives, and accept the personal danger. Yet now, the burden of that choice felt heavier, the margin for error thinner than ever. By mid-August, the secret arsenal had evolved from a hidden workshop into a fully operational support network for frontline armored units. The POW's modifications, though invisible to most observers, had begun to influence operational outcomes in measurable ways. Convoys completed missions more efficiently, tanks survived engagements that would have otherwise immobilized them. Crews reported fewer mechanical failures and greater confidence in their machines. Unseen and uncredited, the Italians' labor was shaping the course of the campaign. Yet, for all their skill, the breaking point was a looming reality. Guards' routines changed unpredictably. Allied officers inspected equipment with increasing scrutiny. Axis reconnaissance grew more sophisticated as the campaign intensified. Each night presented a new challenge, a new test of vigilance, patience, and skill. The POWs understood that their survival and the continuation of their clandestine work depended on absolute discipline. In the quiet moments before morning, Lupo gathered the men once more. "We have reached a crossroads," he said, voice steady but tinged with gravity. "The work we do changes the battlefield, saves lives, and preserves the honor of our craft. But each night brings risk. We must continue with caution, precision, and unity. One mistake, and all of this, he gestured to the gleaming tanks, falls into someone else's hands. The men nodded, understanding that their mission was now as much about resilience and secrecy as it was about mechanical skill. As sunlight crept over the desert, the compound stirred with the sounds of morning guards calling out, tanks rolling, and distant engines echoing across the sand. Yet within the shadows of the workshop, 10 Italian POWs prepared for another night, another silent battle against time, fatigue, and circumstance. Their hands, stained with grease and sweat, would continue shaping the tools of war, unseen but decisive. They were prisoners, yes, but also custodians of an invisible arsenal, their work a quiet defiance against fate itself. By the end of August 1943, the secret arsenal had proven its worth repeatedly. Allied tanks were more reliable, crews more confident, and operational timelines more predictable. Yet the strain on Lupo and his men was unmistakable. Fatigue, tension, and the constant threat of discovery coalesced into a pressure cooker environment. The breaking point was not merely a physical state, it was psychological, a test of loyalty, courage, and endurance that would define the remainder of their captivity. Sicily, August 17, 1943. The first armored columns of the U.S. 7th Army rolled cautiously through the dusty roads outside Gela. The early morning sun reflected off freshly repaired Sherman tanks, their tracks leaving deep impressions in the soft earth. Inside the cockpits, crews noticed something almost uncanny. Engines that purred with unexpected smoothness, gear shifts that responded precisely, and hydraulic systems operating flawlessly despite weeks of combat wear. Far from the battlefield, in a small workshop at Ksar Saïd, Sergente Meccanico Vittorio Lupo allowed himself a rare smile. The POWs had labored in secrecy for months, and now their work was about to meet its first true test. Through stolen intelligence reports and intercepted radio traffic, Lupo knew that German units in Sicily were well aware of Allied armor movements, yet their ability to disrupt them had been inconsistent. The reliability of these modified tanks could tip the scales. As tanks entered contested zones, minor mechanical failures that once immobilized entire units now seemed to vanish. Sergeant Paolo Ricci, assigned to a Sherman nicknamed Aquila, reported over the radio, "Engine holding steady, tracks secure. Everything's running smooth, sir." The tone of his voice carried a mix of disbelief and relief. Across the sector, similar reports came in. Drivers, accustomed to frequent breakdowns, marveled at the dependability, unaware of the Italians working behind the lines. The battlefield itself was a chaotic symphony of explosions, tracer fire, and the rumble of engines. Panzer units attempted to set ambushes along narrow Sicilian passes, but Allied tanks maintained cohesion, maneuverability, and endurance that exceeded expectations. Who would have previously stalled in the desert sand or succumbed to overheated engines, now pressed forward without hesitation, engaging German positions and pushing the front line further. Lupo and his men monitored the reports with quiet intensity. Each radio transmission, each officer's log, validated months of meticulous labor. Yet, even as success reinforced their efforts, the risks remained ever present. Allied reconnaissance planes occasionally flew low over Ksar Saïd, and the possibility of a casual inspection loomed constantly. Any misstep, a missing tool, a misplaced component, a guard overhearing an unfamiliar noise could have unraveled everything. By mid-morning, the true impact of their secret work became undeniable. Units outfitted with repaired and reinforced Shermans encountered enemy armor and artillery positions with a level of resilience previously thought impossible. Tracks that had been prone to breaking held firm, engines overheated less frequently, and crews reported fewer instances of hydraulic failure under fire. Lupo knew that every reliable tank rolling across Sicilian terrain was a testament to their hidden labor, a silent intervention in the chaos of war. The POWs remained in their shadowed workshop, hands black with grease, hearts tense with anticipation, listening to the distant thunder of tank engines and artillery. They were prisoners, yet through their skill, they had become unseen architects of Allied progress. In Sicily, for the first time, their modifications were not just theoretical or preparatory, they were proving decisive, turning the tide in subtle but tangible ways. As the sun dipped toward late afternoon, Lupo allowed himself a single thought. Their labor was invisible, dangerous, and morally complex but undeniably consequential. The Italian mechanics had transformed from captives into custodians of armored power, shaping the battlefield from behind barbed wire and shadowed walls. Sicily, August 22, 1943. The sun rose over the craggy hills near Troina, casting long shadows across a landscape scarred by artillery and flame. Allied forces prepared to engage the German 15th Panzergrenadier Division, which had fortified positions along ridges that overlooked the advancing columns. For the first time, the tanks carrying Vittorio Lupo's secret modifications were entering a pitched battle. In the lead Sherman, Aquila, Sergeant Paolo Ricci scanned the horizon, every sense alert. Crewmen noted how the engine responded instantly to sudden throttle changes, how the tracks gripped the rocky terrain without slipping, a stark contrast to the unreliable tanks that had frequently stranded units during prior engagements in North Africa. Unknown to the men inside, these machines had been silently reinforced. Improved hydraulics, recalibrated cooling systems, and meticulously inspected drivetrains, each intervention executed by the Italian POWs under the cover of night. The first shots rang out from the German artillery atop the ridges. A shell struck near a Sherman in the second wave, throwing dirt and shrapnel over the crew. Normally, such a hit would have risked overheating or mechanical failure, but the modified cooling system absorbed the shock, and the engine kept running at full power. The tank surged forward, engines humming steadily, as if nothing had occurred. From a ridge above, German officers watched in disbelief. "These Shermans, they hold under fire like nothing we've seen before," one muttered. The Allied tanks pressed uphill, suppressing machine gun nests and artillery positions. Each tank that made it through the initial barrage bolstered morale and signaled the beginning of a tactical shift. Behind the lines, Vittorio Lupo and his men listened intently to intercepted radio chatter. Every coded message and battle report a lifeline connecting their unseen labor to real-world consequences. When reports filtered back, engines running, guns operating flawlessly, fewer breakdowns, the POWs allowed themselves a brief, almost imperceptible exhale. They had prepared for this moment, and their work was proving decisive. By mid-afternoon, the German lines began to waver. Shermans climbed the ridges, their reliability unmatched, their firepower relentless. Several Panzer Grenadiers attempted counterattacks, but the tanks' mobility and endurance, fortified by Lupo's clandestine repairs, left them vulnerable to coordinated fire from advancing infantry and artillery. Tanks that would previously have succumbed to engine or track failure now pressed forward, tipping the scales in the Allies' favor. The battle's climax arrived near a narrow pass, where a German Tiger attempted to block the advancing column. Aquila and two other Shermans engaged, maneuvering with surprising precision. The Tiger fired, its shell striking the reinforced side armor, but the tanks held. The Italian POWs' clandestine work had transformed these machines into near unbreakable instruments of war. Within moments, coordinated fire disabled the Tiger, leaving the pass open and the German defense collapsing. As night fell, Allied forces held the ridge. Troina was secured. Survivors climbed out of their tanks, exhausted but alive. The crews had no knowledge of who had engineered their success, yet Vittorio Lupo and his men, still hidden in the shadows of the POW camp, allowed themselves a quiet satisfaction. Their secret labor had not only kept the tanks running, it had saved lives and altered the course of battle in a way history might never fully credit. Sicily, late August, 1943. The humid, sun-baked air carried a tension that clung to the tanks and infantry alike. Rumors had begun to circulate among the Allied forces, stories of tanks that refused to break down, engines that ran without faltering, and transmissions that never jammed under fire. Crews whispered in mess halls and along dusty roads, calling them ghost tanks, a quiet marvel in the chaos of combat. Lieutenant Robert Carter of the 339th Fighter Squadron, observing from a reconnaissance post, noted the effect. Allied infantry and armored units moved with a confidence previously unseen, their morale bolstered not by victory alone, but by the uncanny reliability of their Shermans. Radio logs from August 25th repeatedly mentioned the uncanny endurance of tanks under intense fire. Officers recorded it clinically, unaware that the explanation lay thousands of miles and hundreds of prisoners away, in the shadowed workshops of Ksar Saïd. Within the POW compound, Sergente Meccanico Vittorio Lupo and his team labored at night with renewed urgency. Each tank returned for repair or inspection carried the weight of survival. Sometimes, the men worked in near silence, listening to distant artillery fire as a grim soundtrack to their efforts. Corporale Luigi Ferraro, assigned to engine overhauls, commented once, "If they only knew we are the ones keeping them alive." His voice trailed off, the thought forbidden and dangerous. Discovery could mean immediate execution. Even as Allied units grew accustomed to their dependable armor, German reconnaissance and intelligence reports began noting patterns that unsettled enemy commanders. Units that had once been vulnerable to mechanical failures now advanced relentlessly. Commanders recorded that Shermans consistently arrived at critical points of engagement intact and fully operational. Interrogated prisoners described tanks with engines as if blessed and tracks that never slipped in the mud. Some German officers began to speculate about secret modifications, while others dismissed it as morale-boosted exaggeration. Back at Ksar Saïd, Lupo coordinated repairs based on intercepted Allied operational reports. Each tank, stripped, repaired, and tested, would be returned to its unit, along with subtle improvements, reinforced gearboxes, recalibrated throttles, and more resilient cooling systems. These were invisible interventions, imperceptible to the crews but vital to survival. Lupo's men had transformed the POW compound into a quiet factory of war, a hidden node of influence that reached the front lines with every Sherman that rolled into battle. By early September, whispers of the shadow mechanics had reached the ears of higher-ranking Allied officers. Some dismissed it as superstition, others quietly speculated about hidden talent behind the lines. Yet none suspected Italian prisoners of war, working in secrecy, could wield such a disproportionate influence on the theatre. Lupo watched the reports arrive, noting victories, fewer breakdowns, and higher survival rates. The men shared brief nods of recognition and satisfaction. They had become unseen custodians of armored power, shaping the battlefield in ways few would ever comprehend. The POW's labor, shrouded in secrecy, had begun to affect the war not just mechanically, but psychologically. Allied crews moved with confidence. German units hesitated under unprecedented reliability, and in the shadows, 10 Italian men quietly wrote themselves into history through the hum of engines and the turn of gears, unseen but unmistakably present in every engagement. Sicily, late August 1943. The humid, sun-baked air carried a tension that clung to the tanks and infantry alike. Rumors had begun to circulate among the Allied forces. Stories of tanks that refused to break down, engines that ran without faltering, and transmissions that never jammed under fire. Crews whispered in mess halls and along dusty roads, calling them ghost tanks, a quiet marvel in the chaos of combat. Lieutenant Robert Carter of the 339th Fighter Squadron, observing from a reconnaissance post, noted the effect. Allied infantry and armored units moved with a confidence previously unseen. Their morale bolstered not by victory alone, but by the uncanny reliability of their Shermans. Radio logs from August 25th repeatedly mentioned the uncanny endurance of tanks under intense fire. Officers recorded it clinically, unaware that the explanation lay thousands of miles and hundreds of prisoners away, in the shadowed workshops of Ksar Saïd.